You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Get bellyache. I got a duty right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast, episode 40. What a milestone for our small little slice of space, the final frontier. Joining me as always, Lord Uther, and our recurring host, OCP Senior President Dick Jones. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And may I say, we've boldly gone and baldly gone in many directions on this show, and today's episode promises to be somewhat of a special one as we go in two directions. Honestly, even for the groundbreaking episodes we've talked about so far, somehow still a completely new direction in both episodes for Star Trek, the original series. We get to see a lot of depth of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. And as always, we have some great background to go over. So without further ado, I turn it over to OCP Senior President Dick Jones.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to all you Trekkies out there in Federation space and the neutral zone. We are rapidly approaching the end of season 1. We've still got a few choice episodes to analyze and dissect, including we'll start with what I was shocked to personally admit was one of my favorites this entire first season, A Taste of Armageddon, which first aired on February 23rd, 1967. It was directed by returning champion Joseph Pevney, who, as we remind you each week on the Warp Core, is tied with the most episodes directed with Mark Daniels at 14. The story was by Robert Hamner, and the teleplay was by Mr. Hamner and producer showrunner Gene L. Kuhn. There were some guest actors here, including Lieutenant DePaul, which growing up in the Midwest, that meant Blue Demons basketball, but it also meant that we didn't have Sulu at the helm for this particular episode. We had David Opatashu. David Opatashu plays the lead baddie in this. Gave me kind of a Pedro Pascal vibe, late 60s. So that was an interesting choice there. And we had another ambassador giving Jim Kirk a hard time on the bridge. I don't know what it is, but Kirk never got along with the diplomatic corps, apparently, in these early seasons of Trek. Or they were just all a-holes because they would always just boss him around and try and, we've got to be here on this deadline and so forth. And you will do what I say, Captain. He just never, you would think diplomats were mild-mannered and can talk their way in and out of any crisis, but these guys were always itching to fight. And
they always get to make the final decisions on these missions, which I just thought was interesting. Like their command trumps Kirk's, which was just a weird thing for a diplomat to have that happen.
Right. So Gene Lyons played Ambassador Fox in this one here. And like I say, by the end of the episode, you want to stick him in a malfunctioning transporter. So anyways, A Taste of Armageddon. For fans of 1980s John Badham movies, there was more than a hint of war games and the rogue computer Joshua in this one. Now, we've had rogue computers before. In fact, we just had one in The Return of the Archons in Warp Core episode 39, which you can go ahead and access if you'd like to take Thanksgiving holiday week and catch up on maybe some episodes you've missed. There are plenty now, up to 40 Warp Cores that you can easily digest and goes great with turkey and stuffing. But yes, there were echoes of DNA from that classic 1983 Matthew Broderick, Ali Sheedy, Dabney Coleman computer thriller here. And that's probably why I was so keyed into it. This episode, again, it doesn't necessarily do a lot of exterior spacecraft. In fact, it doesn't do any real space battles like we would get in some of the earlier episodes that we've talked about. It's all done in interiors. They blew a lot of stuff up. I think as we got near the end of the season, they're like, hey, we've got this budget for demolition and explosives. We should probably use it. So there's a lot of things in this one that just go boom. Just let's burn that set and let's burn that elevator / suicide station. I guess that might have been some of the thinking there. But it's really, really well constructed in terms of a situation that would have appealed in the late 60s with the Gene Roddenberry mantra of war and peace, and two societies that have basically eliminated the blood of war and therefore made it more palatable to wage it at the cost of again, still thousands, millions of lives being sacrificed for a cause that a lot of people probably couldn't even remember how it all started. So there's some great philosophical underpinnings we should touch on with this one. And there's also just great crew interactions. Again, McCoy and Scotty is not a combo that you necessarily would dial up first on your bingo card. And yet they spend a good portion of the episode working together on the bridge, on the Enterprise. Again, the network mandate was get me more James Doohan, who kind of looks like an older, wiser cast member from the Monkees, or even perhaps a cast-off Beatle. And I'm watching James Doohan, in this era, and I'm thinking about him in the features, in this, the 6 Star Trek original cast features. And honestly, to me, it's almost like he's a different person. And I don't mean that just from the physical, that he started sporting the mustache and putting on a few pounds here and there with his extended shore leaves, but he was just a different young man, right? As opposed to as they reached that final frontier of middle age and carbohydrates. Scotty reads differently. And I like him in both. I like him as the guy who knows the ship like the back of his hand and then knocks himself out in Star Trek V. And I like this young, sprightly, saucy, willing to give the ambassador everything when the ambassador is giving him grief because Kirk is down on the planet. He calls him a mealy-mouthed gentleman, which, those are fighting words back in 1967. And when the ambassador tells him to turn off the deflector screens, Scotty says, I won't. Like, I love his independent streak. I love he's a little bit of a rascal. It's really a shout out to James Doohan in this episode for taking the lead at, again, the network's insistence that we try and beef up his character here. But let's talk about, again, in the classic Roddenberry tradition, this was an episode that up until the final scene, and I think the episode actually goes one scene too long. I think there was a way to come out of it, and it would have been an absolute stone cold masterpiece. And I think the final scene, a little too neatly, and I know UrzaMaster has talked sometimes about a preachiness factor. There's a little bit too much pat on the back summation of what they just went through in the final moments. And it's a take it or leave it. It doesn't bring down the episode overall too badly, but you could easily have cut right before that, and it would have been like the audience would have just been like on the edge of their seats, like, what did we just see? What does it all mean? So let's talk about what it all means. This idea that you can, legislate or use technology to, again, keep your actual civilizations from being decimated and your infrastructure, torn to pieces, and yet still bearing somewhat of a human cost. And Kirk and Spock and the team wisely trying to shake them out of this and say, no, if you're going to fight, you're going to use real weapons. You're going to use real bullets, and you're going to lose your proud cities and your gleaming parks and so forth. That's what war really looks like. And again, in the context of a furious Southeast Asian conflict that's on the nightly news with Walter Cronkite and the New York Times publishing photos, and young men going overseas in their youth, and many of them not being able to return, in distant there. So there's a lot going on, particularly in the context of when this aired. So let's talk war. What is it good for, UrzaMaster?
And this is one of the finest, shall we say, reflective episodes of the Politico of the day, right? It takes you back. And I think, you could draw the Vietnam parallel quite easily, or the Cold War parallels with Star Trek overall. This takes you back to like a Stephen Crane era, where you're first getting reporting of war to the masses, and the idea of photography and showing people what war really is, who often romanticize war. And this is kind of like the full circle. They've gone through the horrors of war and then found a way to remove the horror from the war, in a sense. Now it's obviously kind of striking, the idea of voluntarily disintegrating yourself to sort of avoid the sheer horror of war, right? And the one thing it doesn't really touch on, but it's of course implied, is that it's men, women, and children, ostensibly, that are being voluntarily vaporized to avoid destroying civilization. I mean, there's some real conflicting feelings there. I mean, the conflict is just in the concept in this episode. There's not really a whole lot of, Kirk out there dropping double axe handles on a Gorn. It's cerebral, in the best way, in the truly, and we'll talk about this somewhat in the next episode, the truly modernist sense of, is there a way to beautify war, or glorify it in a sense that, like, you could have a perpetual 500 years war if you remove the reality. And that is what I think is really poignant, is that, I think, especially of the era, if we're bringing this back to Vietnam, people were seeing the horrors of war in real time. And there were a lot of folks that refused to accept the reality and stuck to the romanticism, this is for God and country, or this is for the righteous good of capitalism or Western culture, however you wanted to put a spin on it at the time for the Hawks. And the Doves, of course, were the ones who are like, no, look at the actual horror of physical combat and maiming and dismemberment and prisoners of war and disease and famine and everything, and even a lot of the unknowns that we would find out years and years later. Like, all of that was truly happening. But did it do anything to actually stop war? Not really, honestly. It was still persisting, and it would still, of course, go on. And Kirk, in this episode, fully admits that. Yeah, we are barbarians. We do these things. But the difference between how we do it when it's real and has real consequences is that, that shock factor, that awe, is something that could dissuade you from continual, perpetual war, which is what these people have essentially predicated their society on. And I think Roddenberry's vision here, or the message that they're trying to send, is like, it's important that we continue to grow our knowledge of what war is and what violence is, because if we don't, if we try and shy away from it, if we try and obscure it, if we try and simply accept the status quo and keep ourselves in blissful ignorance, as these folks do in this episode, there's no reason why we couldn't have this, a 500-year war. Where is it really atrocity? Maybe not in a pristine visual sense, but certainly on a human level, it's terrible. And trapping the Enterprise. I mean, this is trope city, right? The Enterprise accidentally gets into somebody else's conflict. And for some reason, they lack the ability to destroy the Enterprise. That seems to be, up until the movies, pretty perpetual. Like, oh, well, the Enterprise isn't really hurt, but they're in a bad way because we can't really do anything either. And it's like, they're similarly stuck. Like these two warring cultures are stuck in their ways. And of course, we get the very lovely trope of Kirk's Gambit, where he acts on feeling, acts on a hunch, and Spock sees the logic in it, but also says it's most illogical. That I was this close to thinking you were doing something with well thought out intention. Instead, you're operating on a very human sense, and it's lovely because it's classic Trek, right? And what's nice about this episode in particular is that, as classic of a Trek trope or a Trek story as this is not the episode people talk about. This is not the Star Trek original series episodes like Trouble with Tribbles or Space Seed or Charlie X that comes up in conversation a lot. This is the kind of thing that made television of the golden era different than television of today. It had these high points of achievement and these high points of world building, story building, archetype building, without having to be featuring Ricardo Montalban or featuring Q or any of these things that like we've come to know and love about future Trek. It just simply presents a very well written story with very real life implications without being preachy. Well, to a certain extent.
Yeah, this one. Yeah.
Yes.
This one slipped by the scanners, I think, of a lot of people. I'd never seen this episode before. To me, it kind of had a Giver vibe. If you've ever read The Giver, which is a phenomenal book, and even though the movie was different from the book, I like the movie for The Giver as well. And that's actually part of our curriculum, is that they read The Giver to the kids, and I think 8th grade. But it kind of has that Giver vibe where it's like you're trying to protect society, but are you really protecting society and protecting people and you avoiding war, though you're really not doing so, right? You become disconnected, and that's what it kind of feels like when there's no collateral damage, like you said, when there's no collateral damage beyond these lives being gone when they're just vaporized in a sense. It might actually be easier to wage war when there's really none of that collateral damage to it in terms of the cities or anything like that. So yeah, definitely a very interesting take, but again, had that Giver, almost non-emotional feel to it that you get from The Giver, which I've already said that. Thought it was interesting too that Scotty gets the bridge before he leaves. So we're starting to see this, I'm turning it over to you. And I think he was also the oldest cast member. I think he was. But again, just that idea that we talked about last Warp Core, that Scotty's going to start, being the one that's left behind in a sense to be running the show. And I think it's one of the first times too that we see security officers on the bridge. There were two security officers when the episode opens, which makes me think, shouldn't there always be security officers on the bridge? Like,
it seems like a given, right?
It's a pretty vital space, isn't it? I mean,
no, but that raises my big
President.
Why does Kirk need security when they're hiding in the room and they're going to overpower some guards, and Kirk does all of the double axe handle fists and kicks and knocks them all out, and then he points to the guys and then they pick up the stunned guards and put. I mean, it's like he does all the work anyway. Like, why does he have these red shirt guys, on the planet with him when it's like, screw it, I'll knock them all out, and then you guys just, I don't understand
Kirk machismo.
Why he requires.
What's also weird is like, and I think this speaks to just the obfuscation of the war here in this episode, is that the guards don't really fight back very much. Like, nobody's firing guns, nobody's shooting, nobody's really violent on this planet,
Right.
and that's something, like, they're so numbed and so separated from the actual war. They're just sort of like walking into the disintegration chamber. Nobody's getting dragged in or thrown in. Nobody's fighting back, because there's that painless separation. Like the people who step in there, they're not screaming. They're being painlessly, essentially killed, in a way that, like, if you think about it, if you're truly removed, as anybody who's not in the war is, even if you're just seeing these horrible images, coming out of Vietnam at the time, you're still sort of like unaware. You don't really know the impact of what's in those images, and that's the whole PTSD conversation in particular coming out of Vietnam, is that, you could see this and be like, wow, that's really, truly terrible, but you weren't there. As much as you think that that's terrible, imagine somebody who firsthand saw somebody get burnt with napalm. Kind of like they talk about the fusion bombs going off, and it's like, oh, I just lost my wife, and it's like, you don't seem very upset. Like, oh, it's terrible. I'm gonna miss her, but whatever. It's war. The guy doesn't seem upset at all. Even when he's like, well, we could do this a different way. We could find a way out of this. You don't have to do this. He's like, no, I just have to do it. It is what it is. It's like going to the grocery store. We're out of eggs. Like it's so incredible to think that would be one even possible. And then, we have the fortune of time and separation, right? We can look back and be like, there were a lot of people in the era who were just like, yep, that's war. They'd never been to war. They're seeing these images like, I remember seeing photos after the Nazis and all the horrible destruction in Dresden and this and that and the other. And it's like, that's part of it. But you've never been there. You don't know anything about it. And now you see that kind of played out to the umpteenth degree, right? Where they're so disconnected from violence, they don't even know how to respond to a single guy overpowering guards and blowing up a disintegration chamber. They're just like, how dare he?
Which by the way, there was a part where Kirk does like karate chop, karate flip, all these other things, and my thought was they should make him a Mortal Kombat character and have like finishing moves for him.
Yes,
because he was doing all these crazy. He's done the full body jump sideways. Like that could be a move. I mean, he would be an awesome. And I even wonder that when Chuck Norris gets up in the morning and looks in the mirror, does he see James T. Kirk?
Ooh.
One wonders.
One does
One
wonder.
wonders.
So, there were silly hats. I have to say that the guards did have sort of a Dr. Seuss quality. It initially distracted me, but I pressed it on. Vulcanians. I don't like it, and I don't know that it's stuck. But they referred in both of these episodes with Vulcanians. I just, always thought that it was classic and clean and they're Vulcans. And I don't know when they made that transition, but referring to each other and themselves as Vulcanians, that jumped out at me initially. So I'm glad that didn't stick there.
They have some Beta Z. They have some Beta Z powers too, where he can. Did you know that? I didn't know this until this episode. That they could actually like be telepathic through walls. That was I don't think we've ever seen that since, have we?
I don't think so.
I don't think so, because out of the three of us, one of us would have remembered that. So that also caught me way off guard.
I do hate it when and this isn't a crime solely attributed to Star Trek, but when a writer gives a power or some sort of ability that otherwise had never been explored just to solve a problem in that episode. I don't know. Good point. The Dux Ex Machina, the awfully convenient that he's got a low grade. I mean, that might have helped out in a few other episodes if we'd seen it. So, but again, that's not going to deter me from its overall effect. When Kirk gets the drop on Aeneas or Anon 7, and he's just like, I didn't come to drink. I love Shatner's delivery of that as he's like, this is a very impressive weapon, and I'm not afraid to use it. I'm like, that's a very good Jim Kirk line there. I think it's Spock who tells the security, because they have a woman on the security team in this one.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's Spock who doesn't want the female Maya 3. He doesn't want her to try to self disintegrate, and he's like, "You keep an eye on her, and if she tries anything, knock her down and sit on her." And I'm like, I think it was Spock that gave that order. I'm like, it's a good order, like Spock.
Yeah.
So. And then when he blows up the disintegrator, he says he's practicing a peculiar variety of diplomacy, sir. So again, very strong. Like, I understand that later in his career, as this show was winding down its third season, and prior to rejoining the big screen franchise, and then wanting an exit from that, and then changing his mind again mid shoot through Star Trek II. I understand that Leonard Nimoy didn't want to be defined by this role, but boy, is he good at it. And again, once they settled on how they wanted to present Spock, after some initial uncertainty in the 2 pilots that they shot and so forth, once they settled on what his character is and what his voice, in terms of representing pure, cold crystal logic for the audience and so forth, like once they did that, like this, I think, we've talked about the big 3, but I think Nimoy, is actually at the apex of that pyramid, even more so than Shatner and DeForest Kelley. Like, he just absolutely you completely believe he is this character. And even when, and we'll talk about this more in a couple of minutes, even when he breaks character and has to do something different, you completely buy it. So, I mean, hats off, especially in this first season. Like, he found the lane, and much like Ethan Peck has impressed us tremendously with his interpretation in Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which is also part of our Warp Core podcast, by the way. Don't just enjoy classic late 1960s Trek. Get on there with 2023 Star Trek as we explore some of these legacy characters as you've never seen them before. So,
which starts shooting in December, by the way.
Jonathan Frakes returning to direct.
So there you go. And who else would you want behind the camera but a crafty Trek veteran like Mr. Frakes, who again can deliver both the emotion and the spectacle. So no, this episode, like I say, we talked about how the Return of the Archons had a lot of interesting ideas and didn't quite stitch them together into a satisfying whole. This one takes its premise and gets the most mileage out of it that it could. Like, this is a well-realized, well-executed example of a premise. I don't feel like there was fat or that they left some things on the table that they could have cashed in. Again, my problem with the final scene is it just felt too much like, well, we better take the audience's hand and make sure that they sort of foregrounded their message. And I mean, I get it. It was part of the time, and you can't always assume your audience is, they're busy trying to do the kitchen dishes and wait, what did he say? Turn that up. So there were distractions of the day, I'm sure. But I just didn't think it was necessary. I think that they had made all of their points thematically and in the plot by then. I just felt like we were just kind of doing NBC, the more you know, kind of a statement about war is bad. So I didn't care for the last scene, but I don't feel that it in any way diminishes this episode and its impact. So very good job.
Did they kind of do those end caps because people couldn't record and go back and watch again? I mean, to almost summarize the episode? Is that the purpose?
Well, like I said, I not to sound cynical, but you're never supposed to underestimate your audience in their capacity for, I need to know, So they made it, right. Like I said, they made it clear. I just think, coming from me and from where I was doing it as a writer, I just thought like it was just kind of superfluous We didn't really need the, standing on the bridge and then the little like, da da da, little lightness, a little desaloo. I could do without those.
I
But
think that, yeah, that was definitely a product of the era. I think it was something where they needed that Shakespearean break in the tension.
right.
This is a pretty heavy episode, all things considered. They almost needed that little Kirk and Spock back and forth. A little, let's make a little light of the situation. Let's, that could be, because you got to remember, this is the era of Leave It to Beaver and a lot of these kind of let's make everybody feel good shows, and literally instead of a taste of Armageddon, it's more of a taste of paradise on television. Here's Red Skelton and all of these nice little family friendly type shows. This is pretty different, and also being a product of the era of Vietnam, they're getting a lot of crap on TV that's probably bumming people out. I mean, to use a little bit of an expression of the era. And one way to take something that the more learned or perhaps the more situationally aware folks at the time are picking up on and kind of bring them back to a nice psychological center is to give them that little break, that little bit of Shakespearean comedy at the end. And it's like, hey, the moral of this story, kids, it kind of makes you feel a little bit better about it, just because it's like, okay, yep, I get it, I understand, but I also realize that, hey, this is fiction, and like you should remember that, like, yeah, there's a good way out here, but don't be bummed out. Like things will be better in the end, kind of thing. And I do think the scene is a little superfluous, but I also think in the context in which it was produced, it makes sense to be.
Yeah.
Plus, it gives us that plucky sort of TOS, cast chemistry that I think, not that this episode lacked it, but I think the episode kind of needed a little bit of an injection and it could have, if you had taken that same scene, minus the denouement of it, and put it at the front of the episode and had like a little bit of the back and forth we might see in a Next Gen or Strange New Worlds, when they're playing poker, right? Or doing something that's like, we're just building cast member relationship. Put that at the four of the episode and then let the rest of it play out as is. Structurally speaking, I think you have, like you said, like a knockout episode. But I don't know that it necessarily detracts from the context of the time period.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. And maybe that was just a taste of paradise, but we need to see what this side of paradise looks like here. And so we will, journeying forward.
Segue.
Yes, to March 2nd, 1967. We have a new director, Ralph Semensky. And happy birthday, Ralph. He turned 100 this year, still alive and kicking on May 1st. Oh, wow. So happy birthday, Ralph, still with us. And he spent a good part of his directing career doing, again, shows that we are now long since been accustomed to seeing on their resumes, from The Naked City, Route 66, Twilight Zone, The Fugitive, The FBI. He did 6 Star Trek episodes overall during its run. But then post-Trek, he did both The Partridge Family and The Waltons. So I'd like to put those up there on his resume as well. The story was by D.C. Fontana and Nathan Butler. Now, Nathan Butler is actually a pseudonym for Jerry Soule. And we've had Jerry on before. He wrote the Corbomite maneuver. But he was unhappy with D.C. Fontana's revisions. And so he requested and was granted a pseudonym for the story. And D.C. Fontana ends up doing the teleplay for This Side of Paradise. The title was taken from a 1920s F. Scott Fitzgerald novel. And it is based on the story elements of Homer's The Odyssey, particularly the Lotus Eaters. So it has classical, mythological antecedents. And for those of you who like this sort of thing, there's a shot of the bridge an empty Enterprise bridge after the crew has mutinied and left James Tiberius Kirk all alone. But before he enters the bridge, there's an establishing shot of the consoles and the chair. That shot was reused for Star Trek The Next Generation's Relics, in which Montgomery Scott, on a holodeck, I believe, gets to revisit the classic Enterprise bridge. And this was the shot that they based that recreation on or used. So there's a nice little trivia. It will appear again and circling the wheel of time. So we have yet another episode that appears to be shot in lovely Griffith Park, which has been a famous Los Angeles shooting location, much like Vasquez Rocks, as we know, have hosted Gorn and Kelvin Vulcans and so on and so forth. Griffith Park, with its scenic white picket fences and beautiful lawns, it's been a tradition. They've been shooting there for decades, hundreds of years. And so we have another episode that sets there. We have Sulu back at the helm. Always nice to have him there. And at one point, he gets into a fight with a crewman with a shovel, which I think was, I was like, whoa, this is very Streets of Fire here, as they are like beating on each other with garden implements. But here's a show. Oh, and the love of Spock's life, at least for the first time in this season, Layla, is played by Jill Ireland, who is Charles Bronson's beloved, and appeared in 16 films with Mr. Bronson. And their relationship, much like Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward and Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn, like it was Hollywood legend that Mr. Tough Guy, Charles Bronson of Death Wish fame and The Great Escape and all of that, he was a softie when it came to Jill. And I believe she perished from cancer. And it emotionally obviously devastated him and so forth. I'm not sure he even ever remarried, but he carried a torch with her and for her. And this was her starting off in her career, obviously, as a guest bit on Star Trek. And you can believe that she would beguile a Vulcan back in the day before he'd serve some purpose and so forth. But we were just talking about how brilliant Leonard Nimoy had been playing this. And this episode could have very easily gone sideways, right? This very much could have turned into some, Summer of Love, which hasn't happened yet, I don't believe. Freedom, hippie, flowers in my hair, let's go visit San Francisco. Like it very easily could have been derailed. It could have come off as silly. It could have come off as, juvenile or discordant, and it absolutely doesn't. And the key to that is because we get to see a contrasting Spock. We get to see a Spock, and don't forget, they hadn't seen that more emotional side of him in the cage and so forth, because that had never really aired except through pieces of the menagerie. But here is him taking it in a completely different direction. And I mean, you're absolutely like, gobsmacked when he's telling Jim, like, no, I'm not going to rendezvous with you. Spock, I gave you an order. Yeah, I don't care. And then like putting down his communicator and this was, you talk about mutiny. I mean, Spock just laughing and just being like, yep, I really, you go fly the ship, Captain. I'm fine where I am. And he gets very kissy. There are a lot of Spock kisses in this one. I don't know if we're going to get quite as many going forward in the original series run, but he and Jill, I mean, they were making out like a couple of 15-year-olds at the Christmas dance. The episode, I mean, you can quibble with the special effects at the time. We have these ejaculating orchids that spray out the confetti or stuff and makes everybody blissful and serene and peaceful. It turns DeForest Kelley into a bad caricature of a Southern gentleman. About 3 too many Jim boys for my taste, but I mean, you could see what they were leaning into there. And I mean, his ability to conduct a scene, an argument, holding a mint julep, I thought was a nice touch. He was able to pull that business off and still hold a minty beverage straight from the hills of Kentucky. But yes, these flowers, I got a very Invasion of the Body Snatchers. We have spores. They are, alien spores that drift and create this. And then I love that sort of sad, lonely one that just spits on Kirk on the bridge. He's all by himself and he's feeling sorry for himself, and it just goes. And then I don't know why he settles on, this is like at least the second time he settled on, well, the way we'll get out of this is I'll be a racist to Spock. Only this one, he kind of dials it up to 11. Like, whereas before, I think he just made a one-off half-breed reference or something. But here, it's just, 3 or 4 pages of dialogue of just pure filth, running Spock down and so forth. Now, obviously, there's a madness to his method, but he seems to settle on that strategy very comfortably. Like, I know I'll push Spock's buttons, and I'll just be a complete racist. And like I say, to his credit, he takes it to the hilt here. And Spock, you can just see it like wearing him down. And finally, he's like, "I'm going to break your neck like a chicken bone, human." And we get the stunt doubles battling in engineering and so forth. So that those moments there stood out. But I'm telling you guys, like I say, for something that could balance precariously on parody or missing that tone and turning into something that doesn't do justice or honor to the Star Trek tradition, this one completely walks that tightrope and does not careen into, like I say, embarrassing the actors or so forth, and gets fairly thought-provoking. Once again, this idea that, hey, this is a better execution of this concept than, again, I don't want to pick on Return of the Archons, but they talked about being one of the body, and you had McCoy who fell under their spell and so forth. This is a much better executed of the sort of the same idea. They're like, you join our community, give up all your troubles, just be with us. Like, they do a much better job, I think, in This Side of Paradise than they did a couple of episodes prior. You guys tell me what you think of hippie spores and Spock getting all teenage romancy.
I feel like this episode gave off a little bit of an insurrection vibe, actually.
Ooh,
in terms of like the emotional piece and time stopping, even though I really liked that movie. But I feel like there was some of that that was going on. The other thing I noticed was I felt like Spock could have just started singing the Bilbo Baggins song and everything would have been fine, because his outfit like totally lent itself to singing about Bilbo Baggins. Bilbo Baggins. So I was kind of waiting for that to eventually happen.
Nice.
But yeah, that was weird too. The whole lots of kissing from Spock. And now I know where that wonderful Kelvin movie, or whatever, the Kelvin timeline, got the idea for a totally off color Kirk who's just trying to get Spock mad. Think about it in the Kelvin movie when he gets on the bridge and he's got to take the bridge back from Spock. They totally ripped it off from this episode. Another reason why we can just flush those movies down the toilet. But that's a whole nother story for a whole nother podcast, which, by the way, everyone remember, you want to click subscribe so you can get these great and incredible in-depth analysis from one Lord Uther that talks about Bilbo Baggins. I don't know where else you're going to get that or hear that. But yes, I do think it was a great episode. Yeah, McCoy was overplaying the whole, Southern gentleman thing, like even trying to talk. And you could just see like DeForest Kelly totally cannot pull that. I mean, that's not him, but he went for it. Didn't
Yes.
really work. He went
Yes.
for it. I like the Shatner monologue on the bridge all by himself. He's sitting in the chair and he's just like, I guess it's just going to be me, pretty much, until the ship runs out of power or whatever he was saying. Or he couldn't operate the ship by himself, which again, I found that kind of interesting. You think he could just go automated and get out of there if he had to. So convenient plot point, because I think that I guess it took three of them to run the ship in Star Trek 3, I think. No, four of them. Three of them? Four of them?
About three, yeah, 3 or 4.
Yeah, three. Anyway, I did like this episode. You're right. It could have gone sideways. But again, to your point, the person who tried to deny that the character is him, which is obviously Leonard Nimoy, carries it and doesn't make the episode a wonky, trying to get some laughs here and there type of episode.
Right.
It definitely had the very strong possibility of going the route of shore leave and coming across as a little too goofy. But I thoroughly enjoyed this. And I was just thinking to myself, like, how am I going to focus when it's my turn to talk? Because all I can hear is, in the middle of the earth, in the land of Shire, that brave little hobbit whom we all admire, with his long wooden pipe, fuzzy woolly toes. And that I love this episode because it is absolutely trope defining of that, off world, or I should say off ship contaminant again, like in The Naked Time or The Naked Now later, that gives us a whole different perspective on how the crew works together. And we get the love of the ship from Kirk, which I have to say, until Lord Uther brought that up on the Warp Core podcast, which you can get by subscribing to Pending Rebrand, stay up to date with us every single week because we have weekly episodic entries. Until Lord Uther really brought that up as like one of the main things, like you could easily miss that. I think even as a fan, that Kirk and the Enterprise are as inseparable as can be. And I think it brings me back to Star Trek 6, where he's, giving us that little speech about he knows he's going to be okay as long as McCoy and Spock are with him. But it's a little deeper than that. It's McCoy, Spock, and the Enterprise. That if he's got at least one of those things, he's going to be okay. And I think the reason why we see his untimely demise in what is the most fantastic Star Trek movie ever produced, Star Trek Generations, is because he doesn't have any of those things. And here he has the only thing that keeps him from joining the rest of the crew is his love for the Enterprise. Now, we get love of the Enterprise, I think, a little more on the nose with Scotty. And I would have actually liked to have seen that play into this episode somewhat too, because we do see it in later episodes, and one of the all-time greats, we're going to talk about it for sure, and I cannot wait for that episode. But I really like that becomes Kirk's anchor, more so than his love of countrymen or his love of his crew. It's the love of this ship. It's the life that he's really built, and that's where he gets his senses back, and that is where he predicates how he gets everybody else's senses back. And there's sort of that unspoken, almost transgressive level of love between the two. Where the Enterprise is there for him as much as he is there for it, and it makes those scenes in the movies a little more tragic. I know the blowing up of the Enterprise is kind of one of those, they're blowing up the Enterprise again, but you really feel it more, and I think as a fan going back, because some people may say, it's what, 56 years later from this episode now, 46 years later. My math is not great, but some people may say, why revisit some of these old episodes of Trek? why would the Warp Core podcast, of all podcasts, who are known for their up-to-date analysis on their weekly Paramount Plus releases, why are they not talking Lower Decks when they are missing out on what could be an opportunity to talk about modern Trek and where the series is headed? Well, we talk about that with other podcasts we do, specifically the Graying Jedi. But what's poignant about this here, pending rebrand fans, is that this is timely no matter what. There's no loss of poignancy over the love of ship and crew between Kirk and the Enterprise, or Pike on Strange New Worlds and the Enterprise. It's fundamental Trek. It's fundamental to building a sci-fi universe. And what really matters here is that you're seeing all of sci-fi get built out on TV for the future. And this is where you get many a repeated trope. You see this in an Insurrection, the standstill moments in time, the youthfulness returning to characters, or the emotion returning to an emotionless, Spock. And by the way, Strange New Worlds, I got to throw a shout out to them because they're giving us this lovelorn, or shall we say, ladies' man Spock that we don't really see in the original series, except in an episode like this. Only to find out that, Spock's married, by the way, and we'll find this out in a later original series episode. We, of course, know it just from Strange New Worlds and T'Pring, but he still has all these loves of his life out there. It's like, well, Spock's kind of a ladies' man, and I don't think that should go without mentioning, because there's a pretty blonde in every Star Trek original series episode. It just happens, whether it's Yeoman Rand or Jane Q, alien. Spock is, or Lieutenant Uhura, as we'll see in a later episode. Spock or Kirk is always finding somebody in some capacity, but the varying levels of romance are a lot more deep than I think we all kind of remember. And unlike perhaps a Jonathan Frakes version of Kirk on The Next Generation, which we'll get to when we get to that series, Kirk and the varying crew members who have these sort of romantic foibles, it's way more interesting than I think people remember. It's not just like scoring with the alien princess every episode. It's really like functional to the story and to how the resolution comes about. And that's kind of intriguing. Like as a trope, and as somebody who remembers this sort of, memory is unreliable, right? You kind of remember it through maybe the lens of a Family Guy or some sort of a Saturday Night Live or a Mad TV parody of James T. Kirk. Just sort of like, here's the alien woman we have to protect, but also fight, but also I have to make sweet love to her down by the fire. Like, wait a minute. Like, it's not as goofy, I think, as it's been painted in later years. And maybe in future episodes it gets a little goofier. But these foundational episodes, it's like there's real feelings and emotions expressed, but it's not so on the nose. It's not so cheesy as maybe I think we want to remember it as. There's a little more depth there. And it's very apropos that it's based on a modernist novel and, a Homer classic, this level of mythos and archetype and modernist lens of the pleasure machine, if you will. This Platonic and Aristotelian, I don't know if that's a word, but I made it up. And you only can make up words in sci-fi. And on the Warp Core podcast, hit that subscribe button, like, and drop us a comment about my invented word that you're going to use now. Just those machinations of humanity and the dissection of it, if you will, that we see here. It's way deeper and a lot less overacted as I think we remember. And that's from a meta perspective as just a fan, not just a Warp Core podcast host, not just a Star Trek enthusiast or Trekkie, if you will, but just as a fan of good TV. Like, you tend to remember things almost like everything was the Three Stooges, from this era. Like, oh, it's so cheesy and it's just like so PC, because before PC was a thing, because they they couldn't use dirty words on television. Like, actually, it's pretty cerebral. Like, it's pretty highbrow stuff. We just remember the goofiest bits because that's what people have latched onto and turned into the joke over the last 46 years. And that's why, to bring this full circle, why we're doing what we're doing, why we're looking at the original series, because it's easy to forget how truly great these episodes were. I mean, you can say they were great, you can say they're life-changing, you can say they changed the whole world of sci-fi till the cows come home. But until you've tasted this side of paradise, you may not realize how truly great it was.
Was this the episode where Bones talks about having 2 broken ribs, or was it the episode before? Like with his physical?
Yeah, I don't.
Was it this one? Because they found the appendix in this one, where
Yeah,
the guy's appendix regrew.
The magically
Okay,
reoccurring.
so that's why he talked about the broken ribs. So now I want a Strange New Worlds episode when McCoy's on the Enterprise where he breaks his ribs, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see it because those writers on Strange New Worlds are they're that good. But now I want to see that. I mean, it seems like it's a throwaway line, but that's the one thing that Strange New Worlds has done very well is they've taken a few of those things and built some stories around it. So I'm hoping I see that. That was the other thing I had written down too.
You can tell that the writers on Strange New Worlds have probably got degrees in English because they could take a William Carlos Williams poem about a little red wheelbarrow and make a whole season of Strange New Worlds episodes out of it. Just like somebody may have done with a certain paper at one point and took that to a very strange new level that poem had never been taken. I think it's time we bestow our Warp Core ratings on these 2 episodes. I'll reserve mine for the end, but Senior President Dick Jones, please give us your ratings.
Like I said, the second one, This Side of Paradise, being a tightrope episode, Taste of Armageddon being an unappreciated classic. I think they're going to get 7s for me on both score. Again, take away minor quips and quibbles and things of that like. What does it do overall for the characters, for this series, for the mythology? I think both these shows are proud examples, again, of you want to understand Star Trek, you want to understand how it became a cultural touchstone, watch either of these episodes, watch them together, and you get the answer, right? It's science fiction at its most provocative, at its most soul-bearing. And I think these 2 can be put up on display as classic Trek that any audience member can appreciate, out of context, in context. However, if you just sat them down and said, "Hey, watch this," I think they would come away with it with a deeper appreciation of the Roddenberry message and the show's dynamic themes. So 2 7s here.
Yeah, I'm also going double 7s. I mean, this is almost as good as Nimoy singing Bilbo Baggins and William Shatner doing Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. I mean, both episodes sing to me the exact same way as those 2 songs did. And I'm just going to throw this other little piece in there. With very little Enterprise actually involved. We don't get a space battle. We don't get crazy special effects, even remastered. And we are still able to get great stories. Because if there is something that I think Star Trek and even Star Wars fans, we've touched on this a little bit before, sometimes you can get too much of a good thing. So sometimes too many space battles is not good, or too many lightsabers or Jedi, whatever show we're talking about here, because at Pending Rebrand, we talk about them all. And I think that's the other piece for me that I noticed is we didn't need to have photon torpedoes or anything else going on. And we still had 2 fantastic stories that make you think. So yeah, double 7s from me as well.
I couldn't agree more. That sometimes you can have a little too much Cobra Commander
Oh, wonderful.
Nice.
And not enough of all the other things that make a show great. This is double sevens for me. This is all seven fever on the Warp Core podcast, episode 40, by the way. Great milestone. And I don't know that there's a whole lot more that hasn't already been said that I could say here. This is, again, season 1 of Trek is truly outstanding. But these 2 episodes, more so even than Space Seed, in my opinion, and I know that might be controversial, but they've really hit their stride here. I mean, this is the cast, the crew, the writing staff, the directors, producers, Gene Roddenberry. This is everybody hitting on all possible cylinders. That's, to me, that's the real win here for sci-fi fans, for Trek fans, is that these 2 episodes have kind of perfected the formula. Now, Space Seed is a fantastic episode. It's absolutely classic. Obviously we get Wrath of Khan out of it, and there's good reason for that, because it was a phenomenal episode. But even at that, there are elements of Space Seed that without Wrath of Khan, I don't know it's quite as successful as these 2. And that's a phenomenal episode. So that's just the bar that's been set by this first season. It has continually ratcheted itself up, and it started off in a really good place, outside of maybe The Cage, if we count that as the true first episode. But beyond that, I mean, you really get something that is sensational. It's truly special. And again, this is what warrants the Warp Core podcast in 2023 going back and actually talking about a show that's almost as old as, well, Lord Uther and OCP Senior President Dick Jones are. And it's something that, if we think about Star Trek as forecasting the future of humanity, the fact that these episodes have stood the test of time, because at no point did we say, well, I mean, that was just 60s television, right? It's just, you're not going to have the good effects, and no, we haven't even gotten to that. Like, yeah, some of the effects have been remastered, but like we can just accept that without having to even mention it, because unlike some series of the time where you go, that's, obviously that those sets are just 60s sets, the paper walls and cardboard chairs and whatnot. No, this feels very, very real and very, very much like something you would produce today, except with maybe better cameras and better computer graphics. This is the kind of TV that if you are not satisfied with the things that are being put out by the networks now, here you go. You'll never be let down by this. And with that, we conclude our 40th episode of the Warp Core podcast. Fellas, I appreciate you as always, and I hope that as we move forward to strange, newer worlds, new frontiers, new civilizations, we can all live long and prosper.